So I just want to reiterate to everyone that this is a co-organized exhibition between the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati and Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art, curated by Amara Antia and Jade Powers. We will miss Jade. She is moving on to the Harn Museum, but she has been gracious enough to work with us for the past couple of weeks installing this exhibition, and we're glad to have her here tonight. So make sure you say goodbyes, because this will be hopefully not the final appearance that Jade Powers makes at the museum, but we'll miss her very much. I want to thank our sustaining sponsors at the museum, Ellen and Jamie Kopakin, for sponsoring this exhibition. I also want to thank the museum staff who work really hard to protect the museum, to also protect the artwork, to hang the artwork, to all the administrative duties that we do here, and making events like this possible for us. They're an amazing group of people, so if you see them around, they might be wearing our new name tag, so it's worth saying hi because there's a lot of creative individuals that work at this museum. I want to thank our docents and volunteers who do a great job supporting the efforts that we do here at the museum by interpreting the things that we do, by giving tours, meeting with groups of all ages, all generations. It's a fantastic group of people, and that program is sponsored by the family of Mary Beth Smith. I also want to thank Karen and Jack Holland for supporting our Visiting Arts program. They make it possible for us to continually have artists here speaking about their work and doing wonderful and amazing things. And I want to just kind of make sure that we know who our speakers are tonight: Alice Tippit, Rashawn Griffin, and Jonathan Christensen Caballero. So those will be the artists from the regional exhibition who will be speaking with us tonight. This 3 of 23. There are other artists here with us this evening as well, and I just want to thank them for making the trip to Kansas City and joining us this evening and celebrating our exhibition with you. So thank you so much for coming as well. I also want to make mention that this is the first exhibition that has a digital catalog. It's our first time kind of embarking on that new adventure, so thank you, Jade, and thank you, Amara, for doing that. It gives a lot of good insight into what's going on in the exhibition, and you can access a ton of information about the artist and the museum catalog through the QR codes that are all over the exhibition. You'll see the first one on the front title wall. So anyway, on behalf of the Kemper Museum, I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight, and I'll hand it over to Jade Powers.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming. And to get started, I'd love for each of the artists to briefly talk to us about your practice. So we will start with Alice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Tippit. I currently live in Chicago, Illinois, but I'm from Kansas City. I was born in Independence, Kansas. And it's nice to be back. And I have to thank everybody here for putting together this awesome show and taking good care of our work. This is my work behind me here. So I started making paintings about 15 years ago. I've worked in other media, but painting is kind of my primary medium, but I also work on paper and work in other media as the kind of subject demands. I think of myself as a language artist, someone who has a deep interest in like the history of words and wordplay and how we make meaning and how that's constructed. But I express that interest through visual means, so primarily. So I don't work with actual like text or written language very often. So some have compared my process to that of a writer. So I work on images for a while. I don't just approach a canvas and start painting. And it is something of an editing process done through drawing, and in which I'm working on an image until it kind of strikes the right sort of tone. I like to create images that are open-ended, that the viewer can read into, but that look like communication or language. And some of these slides behind me are installations, and some are of individual works. When installing a show or a series of works, I do like to pair and kind of create a conversation between those works. Oh, I don't need need to go to anything in particular. Okay. But yeah.
Thank you so much. That was great to, begin the conversation about your work. And Rashawn, would you like to tell us about yours?
Sure. Hello? Whoa. I'm gonna take the clicker and move forward. Hey everybody, I'm Rashawn Griffin. I broke my leg about mid-February, and it was in the middle, exactly 2 weeks before this piece was getting picked up by a museum. And I'm telling this story essentially because the curator called me and was like, well, what do you need? Do you need an assistant? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, do you need help? Do you need things? I was like, I don't know. And then she asked me questions about the work, and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. And it suddenly it felt like I was cut off from my brain. And I broke my leg pretty severely. I had to get surgery. I've been walking for about 48 hours now. It's been 2 days, so I have this cane. So this is a little bit of a celebration for me. But essentially, I realized being cut off from my body, I was kind of cut off from my work. I often say, I don't make work from a place of language. You were just talking about language in a way, insofar as I have words, you have thoughts, you have a thought or an idea, and you articulate that idea, and then you make it into a body of work through the process of making. So the process of making an art is to articulate the idea that's out there in the world. Is that making sense a little bit? And then you kind of engage with that. And it suddenly occurred to me that my process of making, my conceptualization process, was entirely intrinsically linked to my body, to how I physically find something. I collect materials in the world, I organize them through my body, and I kind of make up ideas or things through that process of doing something. And so it's kind of a little bit of a backwards process where I'm sort of physically engaging in these things and then making this stuff. But that also kind of relates to this work too, which I call a changing room. Here's the clicker. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, which has these sort of mirrored panels, these sort of mirrored plexis in there. The way you would come across a changing room, where you'd see the clothes. So it's this implication of a body within there, but also this kind of removal of a body. The mirrors kind of put the viewer in the piece, but also it's the walls are made of clothing. The gestures, these little clay balls of gestures, they're things you do with a hand. There's all these gestures that kind of relate to the body, and also relate in a way to self-portraiture. I think a lot of my work is sort of how do you make a self-portrait? How do you represent yourself without necessarily putting yourself in there? And it was just weird to be okay, yeah, this is all kind of tied to what it is I do and what it is I happen. I also realized what a great community of people I have in Kansas City, because I don't remember putting this together at all. I just had a lot of my friends come over and help me, and half of them are in this room right now, which I'm really grateful for, because they basically had to put the work together in those 2 weeks. I think the work got picked up March 1st. I had surgery March 2nd. It's been 3 months that I've not been able to walk since then. But it's kind of given me a little bit of a reflective time. So this is one installation that's up right now at, this is NSU Fort Lauderdale in Florida. This is another show that I have up right now in the Momentary, which is in Crystal Bridges. So it's only 3 hours away. You can go down and see that too. And so this is another installation where I'm sort of playing with this idea of mirroring, this sort of putting the body in there, but also the clothing and the relationship to the body, and also just the relationship to stuff. I think a lot of my work sort of deals with public space and finding these architectural things that you act with publicly, but making a space for having these private interactions, these these personal moments, these moments of subjectivity that kind of happen within there. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from as a whole when I'm making this work. There's a picture of me. I actually painted myself in this piece. I'm wearing a coat that was my grandmother's, that for some reason I have it now. I don't know how I have it, but I kind of love it within there. And so there's kind of a self-portrait in this piece, kind of around my stuff and these things that I'm making. Is that making sense? I think I'm done. I'm gonna pass it on. I'll let some other people talk.
Wonderful, thank you. And that's a really nice segue, actually, into thinking about Jonathan's work and your practice, and thinking about the body and the way that you use it.
Here's a clicker.
All right, my name is Jonathan Christensen Caballero, and I'm really grateful to be here. I just want to say first thank you to Jade and Amara, to the Kemper, to the CAC, and everyone here tonight. I'm super grateful just to be part of this. My work, so this sculpture, Hijo Mío, it's really, my own work is figurative sculpture that with an emphasis and really focus on Latino, Latin American labor and immigrants. And my mom being from Panama, she moved to the United States in her early 20s, and then I grew up in Utah. And so that being the backdrop, and my father, Scandinavian descent instead, but both of them doing labor jobs to support the family. And that really left a really strong impact on me as a person, as well as then the artwork that I make. Just because then I'm constantly aware of who are the people around me, who are doing the jobs around me, who is often running the machine versus who's actually in the ditch with a shovel. So all these different kind of construction techniques, as well as working in factories, service industry, all the things that I think about and the very things that are always around all of us. And I'm always trying to be mindful of who are doing these labors and who are the beneficiary of these labors. And within my own practice, I'm thinking both of a lot about family, thinking about the motivations that people do to continue these jobs that are really quite stressful on the body and really kind of degrade the body over time. And I'm trying to contrast both the kind of the sweetness and tenderness that you could see in Hijo Mío, as well as then the physical kind of sacrifice that then is taking place within then this body that is also being buried inside the wall. And you'll notice that within a lot of these practice, the figures are also then wearing headdresses, or there's kind of iconography from Catholicism, and as well as then different kinds of materials such as reference to gold and denim, indigo, and different types of materials that the laborers themselves have access to, or they're currently working with, or materials that they themselves have maybe associations with the working class or the working poor. And as of late, I've been this last year actually a resident at the Lawrence Art Center. And in particular, I'm originally from Utah, but I've been living in the Midwest now 3 years in Indiana, 2 years now in Kansas, and been in particular studying and learning about then the Mexican immigrant laborers and their families who worked the railroad in Lawrence, as well as then really through Kansas and southbound. And thinking about what it means to be these laborers and who is really getting to be, the beneficiaries of all the things, all the produce, all the infrastructure. But then who is actually in there every day making sure these things come to us, making sure we're fed. And this in particular is a piece that I finished just recently and is a wall hanging. And you'll notice, though, that the spikes on the neck itself is then in reference to the railroad. And I can talk about that more later, but that's really a big part of my work, figuration and what it means to be Latin American in this country.
Thank you, and thank you all. This is, really exciting, and you all are making my job quite easy, because my next question was going to be, each of you have a connection to either Missouri and or Kansas, and if you could talk about how that has framed your work, if it has, and then specifically if it has in the regional.
I don't know if we should keep going in the same order.
Sounds good.
It's fine. Okay, so I don't know if you can draw a direct line from having grown up here to the work that I make now. But I also, because of my experiences here in Kansas City, I don't think I'd be the artist that I am if my mother, who's here back there, hadn't enrolled me in the Nelson early childhood programs. So as a young child, I was going to the Nelson Art Museum regularly and making work in their classrooms. And then we were just at the Nelson today, and I was like, we have to go downstairs so I can visit my old classrooms. So without that early experience, which was so valuable, and it's so great that that was available to me, who knows who I would be? I mean, I could say some things very cliched about the Midwest, like open spaces and being plain open or something, because of the way that my work operates visually. But I don't want to play you like that. So I won't.
I'm literally laughing at my mother who's sitting here in the front row because I also took classes at the Nelson. I believe I was 4 years old, was I? Yeah, when I first took art classes there. That was my first experience to art. Was like exact same thing. And I remember thinking like, wow, this stuff is weird and it has these crazy stories and also it makes no sense whatsoever. It's kind of has this strangeness. So that's still kind of how I feel art should be a little bit. Like when I'm making things, I still think about this like, oh, there's a story behind this and it's kind of beautiful, but I also like, I'm curious as to what it is, you know? And so I feel like I got that from the Nelson. I make work directly about Kansas out in the world too. I think it was the 2008 biennial, Whitney Biennial, I had a live audio feed from a field in Kansas close to where I was growing up to a space in New York, to the Armory space that was out there. And so if you went into the space and you knew what was happening, it was kind of cool. It was like a landscape. Like you could hear the sound, you could kind of picture something far off in the distance, and you knew it as Kansas. And that was kind of important to me. And I think pictorially, I also make a type of generational abstraction where I'll draw something and then redraw something, and then when it ends up, it'll be something very abstracted from where it was a little bit. And so a lot of the things I would draw when I was away from Kansas was this landscape. I was looking for this horizon line, for this sense of space. I remember when I first I did my undergrad in Baltimore. When I first went to Baltimore, I remember thinking like, why am I inside all the time? Because I'm so used to this open sky, to like seeing a storm come in, like this sense of space really kind of grounds me physically. And so feeling like that, I also thought I lived in the mountains. And someone's like, that's just a hill, Rashawn. You just haven't been to a mountain before. Like I was like, oh, I live in the mountains. It's like, this is just Baltimore. It's just a big hill. So I was like, oh. But that, yeah, literally that sense of Kansas and that sense of space has kind of become something for what I do. It becomes a grounding point for my sense of space and how I kind of interact with that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I guess I'll just dive back into where I kind of left off. Being somebody who's actually not from Kansas, or really the Midwest, I find myself gravitated to try to learn and be a student of the people who have come here before me. The other people who also called this place home who weren't born here. And in that way, trying to figure out what kind of connections do they have to me, or what kind of parallels do we have in our own lives. And kind of, as I was talking about with this one, thinking about, people who've been here before, and in particular, learning about essentially the families who are living in different apartment complexes type thing, building structures that were La Yarda in Lawrence, or different places from the Santa Fe Railroad Company. And their lives were very different from each other. Some of them more rural than others. Some had running water. Many didn't, though, to be honest. And trying to figure out how I find myself also in the same context, in this kind of continuum of what it means to be labor in this country. And so I think more than anything, it's just like trying to figure out how I can have this relationship to a place, even though it's, me seeking out people who are also, in a sense, newcomers to this area.
And how do each of your works play with the recognizable and the elusive? How do you provide clues for your viewers while also allowing them to discover aspects of your work for themselves?
I use recognizable imagery in my work, but there's sort of a effort to delay, I guess, that recognition. So just speeding back through, just by way of example, this first image is an example of how I might take something that's recognizable, like a feather or like a head of hair, and then through working on that image, inverting the relationship, say, of the head of hair to, like, and making it into a well or a bowl, and that smile of the feather becomes a smile. So that's like, I will use like scale or color or just the relationships between the shapes or forms in an image to then delay that recognition.
Oh, is it me? Yeah, it's me. Yeah, I'll take the clicker. Let's see here. The question was, how do we give people clues into the work? What's happening within there as the viewer? I feel like I have a very sensory and tactile experience with the world. And I always like the sort of affect that certain materials have. And when I say affect, I mean that like you can feel something when you see something, like if a room's covered in fabric or if something smells like cookies or something like that. Like they have memories, and there's like something that's kind of attached to those memories and those things. And so I try to pay attention to those sensory inputs to kind of make a connection between something that may seem a little bit austere and a little bit foreign and something different. And so that kind of, for me, that brings kind of a questioning into both what's familiar and what you understand, but also what is surreal, almost like a science fiction type of a thing. And so I feel like the questions the viewers have when they view my work, like, hey, what is this thing? How do I view it? Where do I go through? Those are the questions I'm kind of asking myself when I'm making the work. And I oftentimes display the work. Like when you look at an installation like this or a picture like this, it's in a very non-hierarchical kind of display. So it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure novel. Like you can go into one piece and kind of be like, oh, this is really cool. I like what's happening here, or respond to the color. But you could also, go deeper into something and read something and have a different sort of sensation within that. And so I kind of like making a layered experience, I think, for the viewer, because that's kind of my experience with art, is to make something that sort of operates on a few different levels, like what's within there, what you see, but also like what you can kind of get into too. But yeah, I also think, I don't know, ultimately too, like sometimes I talk about abstraction, and how like abstraction works. Like if you take something and you draw something and then you redraw it, so it gets like more and more abstract from where it is, there's always going to be this kind of personal layer of subjectivity that the artist has between the subject matter and what's happening within there. And so it's almost like you get to have a private conversation with the viewer, because they have to talk to you on your own language. Like you have to get into your language and understand the language, and you kind of respond to it in that way. And so I also like that tension between something being private and something that's in there and something that's public. A lot of what I do is just figuring out how do I deal with public space, with like something within there, and finding a space that I feel like I can relate to, in art or in the world, if that makes sense. Am I making any sense? Are you guys there? You're falling asleep? You can go, Jonathan.
Could I actually have a clicker for a second?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to get to a picture of one of the figures with the headdress, just because. So within my practice, I would say the thing that's most recognizable and obvious is just that they're people. That they're bodies moving through space, and they're interacting with each other or by themselves. They could be either together with somebody or isolated. And I think that then those things affect the narrative that I'm trying to convey. And I think then where some of maybe the level of abstraction or the different, maybe the elusive quality that maybe you asked about, comes really more within the kind of the color palette, as well as then some of the pre-Columbian iconography that I'm using. Because, being my mom's from Panama, and, growing up in the United States, I didn't get to really, at least within the public school systems that I went to, learn much of that history. It was not at the forefront. And it was something that then I've had to delve into and research much further on my own, really. And learning the vast history of figuration that is throughout Latin America, and learning the different color palette that's there, learning the different materials that people had access to and made artwork from. And so within this, you can see that they're bodies, but then their bodies then are made up of clothes, and their clothes have been cut up into long strips and bound and woven into each other. And so it's like, why is the clothing there? It's all secondhand clothes, something that can define somebody in economics and what resources they have access to, but then it actually physically becomes their bodies themselves. And then the third layer of that abstraction really goes into those headdresses and the body paint that's on them, because it's like in those I'm referencing pieces of art, murals, sculptures, whether they be in gold, ceramics, or stone. And each color then has its own level of representation, yellow being alluding to gold, green to jade, blue to indigo and wool, and read to the tradition of using cochineal dye. So there's really more of like a very kind of, there's always a choice for each color, and trying to find out how I can express that within the color palette. And even though I'm maybe processing, essentially clothes to be these different parts so that they can be, kind of give the experience that you're, and recognizing their history of their culture, but not in a way that is like necessarily a direct representation of it. Because as a person who, migrates, you no longer have access to the same materials, the same things. And so it's like, how can I find a way to give representation to those things, even though you no longer actually have those ingredients anymore?
Thank you, and I really appreciate this question about abstraction, and I hope that once you all go into the galleries, you'll see all three of these artists are in different spaces within the gallery, and they were also in the CAC, but there are these wonderful through lines that you can find even though their works are represented differently. So I'm glad that we brought that conversation up. So then, Alice, I have a question for you. Your paintings create a tension between what is shown and what is hidden. And I'm wondering, how do you achieve this balance between abstraction and representation? Then if I could see the clicker.
So yeah, it's the tension and that balance. It's kind of it's what I'm seeking in any one image, if I need it. So this is actually the installation of my work at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati. So that balance, that tension, it definitely comes and arrives usually in what I talked about, that kind of editing process, where I'm sort of playing with the elements and shifting them around, working with them until I arrive at something that I think has tension. And what I'm seeking is this kind of is a experience for the person who approaches it, in which it's kind of a slowing down meaning making. They look like communication, but they aren't as maybe simple as they might at first appear, I guess. So that dynamic tension between that simplicity, but then the complication of what it might mean. So here's a head-on. Yeah, so maybe talking about the furthest one on the left is titled Fathom. And working with that image, I remember working with the figurative shape, the leg that sort of folds over and forms a curtain. And that changes depending on how it's oriented, obviously. And I wanted it to seem like a curtain. It's also made strange because it's a leg that is impossible. It bends in more places than it should. And then, so seeking that mysterious, sort of elusive image is my goal. And that is done through balancing, I think, between representation and abstraction. Yeah, and I just want to say something about the title. I think titling is very important to me. So because I do think about words and how they operate, I don't want a title that describes what you're seeing or answers the question that the image is asking. I want it to sort of extend it further. And so with Fathom, it does allude to this, I guess, the sort of deep sort of space, that the idea that you're at a threshold and you're looking through. But it's not telling you that that's what it is, and that's very important. I hope that answers.
No, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And Rashawn, and yeah, you can move the clicker to the next slide, maybe. Yep. Yep, perfect, thank you. And so this question is about the work that's in the exhibition, and it's so exciting to see so many of your drawings in one installation. And I was wondering if you could tell us, how do each of the works within your series respond to each other?
Okay. Is that working? Yeah, okay. Short answer to that, I don't know. But long answer, just to confuse you guys a little bit further. What I have up in the show are drawings, and most of these drawings are representational drawings. They aren't even abstraction. And I started this series about 6 years ago, and it was done over the course of 5 to 6 years that I started this series. And I started this series essentially because I was just feeling overwhelmed, and I didn't want to think about art. I didn't want to do what I was doing. There was just a lot happening that I sort of thought, all right, I'm just going to stop here. And I was at a residency at the time, and my friend Matt, who's a painter, Matt Phillips, gave me some paper and said, hey, here's some paper. You want to do something? And so I just kind of did what I grew up doing and what I always do, which is just kind of like draw. Just kind of do what was around me, which my parents can kind of testify to, draw over everything. And when I said I don't make place from a place of language where I'm starting with an idea and then articulating it, that goes 3 times for this. Like I literally was like trying to think about nothing, and I just kind of let the work happen. I didn't even know I was making a series at the time, honestly. I had the paper and I would start working, and they would originally, like a lot of them started off as like, I think the first drawing was me just painting what was outside my studio. It was sort of me kind of documenting spaces that were around, things I had, experiences, and then as the process kind of kept going, do I just have the 2 images? Yeah, it's just the 2 images. So as the process kept going, and it's sort of me looking back on it, it sort of realized that I was kind of collecting without even knowing that I was collecting these spaces and these places and these times. Because this became a project, it was something I could just carry around with me in my backpack. And so I would start a drawing maybe if I was in upstate New York or someplace else, and I think that one's in Norway when I did that. So I would kind of carry them back with me and sort of add to it as time was going on. And I think as I was doing that too, I realized I was also kind of collecting texts and language at the same time, that things were kind of going on. And I grew up actually being interested in graphic novels and comic books and all that sort of stuff, and so that's kind of like the visual language that I was kind of relying on a little bit too, both in terms of depicting the space, but also finding things. My mother is actually, my mother's kind of a collector. She collects a lot of stuff too, and I don't like things, like everything. Like I say she's a collector. It's like it's kind of a little bit extra, but and I don't do that. But I also realized at some point I was collecting language, and I was collecting places. I was collecting ideas of these spaces and kind of organizing them. And through the process of doing that, I was sort of making a new language that sort of related to one to the other. And so when you see them all together, on one hand, it does act like a travelogue, I think somebody said. Like, here I was doing this over there, I was doing that over there. But I also feel like there's this other layer of information that's happening too, where it's like, I think sometimes there were text messages. I think there's some embarrassing writing that I put up there. Like I sort of took the filter down and I let whatever was coming in. I think there were some grocery lists within there, like things I had to buy at the store, hey, and then like, an embarrassing message from an ex, like it's all kind of in there. And at some point I started making up my own spaces, and going back into it, I was kind of making up these fictional places too. And then some of the text becomes fictional and becomes like a process of language. And so it's like a process of editing the whole thing. And so, I mean, ultimately, like, once I see them all together, what happens for me, and what's a little shocking, is I really started this piece as a way to not think about myself, as a way to not do anything, just kind of like go into this autopilot, and I have something that's way more personal than I ever thought it was going to be. And it kind of speaks a little bit more to the truth of who I am, in a way, like in my own experience. But that wasn't like an intention, It just sort of like is how the piece happens. And so in some pieces like this, for example, like that piece in the corner, for example, this, I was obsessed with this phrase, familiar as the back of your hand, which was the title of the last show I saw. I have vitiligo. And so vitiligo, it means my skin changes. Like, it's white, it's black, and if I'm out in the sun too long, it comes back, so it's constantly shifting. And this sort of started actually started when I was 18, but up until I was 25, it was never above my hands. It was never above the knees. And so I remember thinking, like, this phrase, familiar as the back of your hand, and I would look at my hand and be like, I don't know whose hand this is. This isn't my body. Like, I don't know what's, and so I was experiencing this weird dislocation between my own body and, like, the image of myself and what was happening, and trying to adjust to that thing. Like, it's still something that's kind of in my mind a little bit. Like, when I'm, like, even now, this is camera guys in my face. I'm like, like, what's happening here, Like, it's a little bit funny. And so this phrase, we no longer recognize the backs of our hands, is kind of like speaking to these things that was sort of happening, this relationship to the body and the body has to space. And so that can read as a very esoteric kind of weird thing within there, and nobody's going to get that story. Nobody's going to know what that is going into it, but I know what it is, and I can tell you that story. And so there's all these moments that kind of accumulate through the thing, so you can kind of get a sense of a person through that. Does that make sense? Am I okay? I'm talking a lot.
No, thank you. This is really helpful,
Yeah.
really, so far for both of you to understand your works.
Yeah.
And it will be for Jonathan as well. So, Jonathan, your work is at times autobiographical while also addressing more general socio-political topics related to the U.S. and Latin American border policies and Mesoamerican histories and traditions. Can you talk about what inspired you to make this particular new work for the regional?
Absolutely. So this sculpture, Envíos a mi hermano, shipments to my brother, is really just showing two brothers in this way I imagine it. And within this particular narrative of one brother being on one corner of the sidewalk while the other one is on the furthest diagonal, them being separated then by essentially a stream or a river of denim pulp that then becomes the water that they are floating the boats on. And I actually grew up making these boats, and I was making them instead out of paper, and I was floating them down the ditches alongside streets. And so that's something that my mom actually taught us to make. And then where this piece kind of comes in is that it's something that comes from my own experience, but really the experience of anybody whose families have emigrated. And only so much of your family might actually move with you. It might be, your immediate family. It might be yourself alone. Maybe you're lucky and actually have a group that all come together, or at least in kind of stepped phases. But the thing is that we end up having these relationships across countries, across borders, across bodies of water and land, but there is still a continuation of those relationships. One of those being, and is so common, is remittance. Remittance being that you're sending money back home to your family to help take care of them. And so Envíos is really also, if you were to see a place like Best Western that is the signage to send money back home, that's Envíos is the way that you send money back home. And so I named this piece, based on that kind of experience of them sending shipments to each other, sending that care and sending that love that it's really on this vehicle and moved along through this labor that they are doing for each other. And I think that, this experience that I have with this piece, and thinking about the shipments to each other is not unique to myself. It's something that is common and, really in many ways in many other countries makes up a significant amount of the countries' GDP. It's really quite common. And so I just kind of think about how my mom worked as an elementary school cafeteria lady to send money back to my abuelita, my grandmother, my bisabuelo, and my great-grandfather, and, other family members. And so I think, with all these pieces that are, might kind of start from a place of autobiographical, it's really kind of realizing how these things create something in common with me, with other people who have also immigrated.
Thank you, and we could talk forever, so we want to be sure to open it up for questions from the public. So please, if you have questions, I believe there's someone walking around with a microphone, just raise your hand. I know. Oh, there's one there.
Thank you. This is directed to Ms. Tippett, is it? Do you get uncomfortable trying to explain what a work of art represents to you? Does that remove some of the mystery from it for the observers?
I don't know if I get uncomfortable, but that certainly isn't what I want is for people to approach it themselves and not have me leaning over them, telling them how to feel about it or think about it. I don't think they're wide open. They do. In the imagery that they use, it's not like there isn't an ability to come to the same conclusions that that I thought about while making it, but I don't want to impose those.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason I ask that
Yeah.
is that you mentioned a leg and the curtain, and once you mentioned that, that's all I can see.
Yeah. Normally I wouldn't tell you all that, but I'm here on this panel, so I did.
Yes, I didn't ask her to talk about all of them. So.
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion that like there are times when I will have to talk about them or where they came from and what I might have thought about while making them, and this is one of those situations, and I'll do that for people on spec.
Any other questions? Sure.
This one's also for, is it Alice, yes? I'm just curious, as a writer myself, you say you work with language and words. Do you start with a word and then transfer that to the visual concept? Or could you talk a little bit more about that process you go through from language to visualization?
So sometimes I might encounter a word or a series of words or words that are like each other, or be reading about the etymology of a word, and an image will come to mind, or it's just thinking about that space, I guess, where the word changed. I can't really put a pin right on something like that. And other times it just starts visually, just through drawing. So I think I work with images like I might work with words. And so maybe I probably didn't explain this well enough, or how I think about it, but I do think about rhyming, and just shapes and forms. I think about kind of what I call the grammar of the image, so the components and how shifting those components around changes it, how color might change it. And so that, for me, is also part of that language play. But I also do a lot of collecting of words and thinking about those words. I mean, there was a piece early on that was just distant furniture, it said, and that just comes from me playing with language in my sketchbook the same way that I play with images. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Somebody else. Next.
More questions for you, for Alice.
Hello. My question is for Jonathan. You're very considerate about the community that you live in and how it relates to your work. I'm wondering if you've ever thought about site-specific work in future projects?
Yeah, I guess the kind of the newest iteration of the work that I'm making right now, I feel in so many ways is site-specific. The wall hanging is only one piece of, that's a new body of work that's going to be featured at the Lawrence Arts Center. And many of these pieces revolve around the Mexican community. And so I guess in many ways, I think that the site-specific nature of it, especially as somebody who's, an outsider, I feel like is really an opportunity to learn about people. Because, when it comes down to it, my motivation to make art revolves around people and their lives, and I think that's what gives both meaning to the work as well as makes it meaningful to then the viewers themselves and the people who get to see that and maybe even see themselves within the practice. And I think that I don't think it'll be the end. I think that I could find myself continuing down this kind of stretch and train of thought of how can I tap into the community of where I'm living or near, or maybe then furthermore, how can I find maybe these little pockets of similarities within all over the United States?
Not to go far. This question is for Jonathan too, following Nicole's question. Have you ever done photography or thought about, because when you go into these communities, I'm just thinking about different ways to then represent and so people are maybe actually seeing themselves in these spaces maybe that they haven't visited, like the Kemper, or just being not to be a generalization, but I don't know, I see photography maybe making its way into your work. I don't know why, but it just came to me.
Yeah, even I haven't really shared many photos yet, really, but I did take some digital photos of the area that was La Yarda in Lawrence, because the structures there are no longer really, it was destroyed by a flood. And so it's kind of trying to figure out how to kind of connect to a place that is no longer. But actually, after my solo show, I'm going to be doing some life casting. So not necessarily photography, but working with then former residents of La Yarda or their descendants. And so in a sense, it's like kind of working directly with the faces, and the hands of the people who have that kind of connection to a place. But I think photography absolutely could have, be almost like a continuation of like maybe surrounding on the walls, as in giving more context to the sculptures that are floating kind of more in the middle spaces.
This question is for Rashawn. Hi, Rashawn. My question is, you have lived in other cities, bigger cities. Can you describe the ways in which your work changed when you moved back home here?
Yeah, I think I can. I was hoping you guys were just gonna ask them questions all the time. I think,
It is the regional, after all.
It is, yeah. I spent a good amount of my adult life on the East Coast and just kind of traveling places, I think, for doing things. Actually, no. Traveling happened once I came here. I think Kansas, my work changed because I had a lot more freedom. Like, that's one of the best things about being in Kansas, is I could go places and I could do things pretty easily in a way that my Midwest roots wouldn't let me leave New York once I was paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month. Like just like a practical way. Like I was just like, no, I'm staying here. Like this is, this is what I'm doing. But moving back to Kansas, it sort of opened me up to doing projects like in Norway or Mexico or wherever. Like I would just take advantage of these opportunities to kind of do things. And so it physically changed my work, specifically, the imagery, the stuff that was sort of about Kansas kind of left a little bit more, it just left a little bit. Like I didn't really have the nostalgia or the need for the place where I was, because I was kind of there. And so that specific type of dislocation that was happening in my work that you could hear in the soundscape or the landscape, that kind of shifted into something else that I think allowed it to be a little bit more personal, a little bit more me, like a little bit more me came out of it. But also, like what you can see in the drawings too, and what's happening is I started collecting things from out in the world, from where I was, like the different places I was going into it. And Kansas kind of became the place where I came back to make everything. Like I literally, like my studio's in Kansas, I almost make everything. And I can't think of, there may not be one drawing that I haven't worked on since it was in Kansas. Because if anything's in my studio, it's up for grabs, by the way. Like if something's in my studio, I will draw on it, I will paint on it. So anytime you see collage or anything cut out or thread or text or something or anything kind of built into the work, that was probably done here in Kansas. And a lot of the imaginary stuff, when I'm imagining spaces, that happens here. But as I'm going around, I'm kind of collecting things, and kind of bringing them back. Maybe it is kind of a cheesy metaphor, but I still think it's powerful. Like when I think of like Proust and like the remembrance of things past and like the history, it's this metaphor of he sits in bed and thinks and dreams about his life, and goes out and lives it. Kansas is it's how I filter the things, it's how I get the things in there. And so for me, it's been kind of great. It sort of has opened it up, I'd say. Yeah. So I have more experiences in the world since I've been in Kansas.
Perfect. This is also for Rashawn.
Okay.
To follow up on that,
Yeah.
would you say that the medium is very important to you in terms of, because so much of your work is experiential, walking through sort of experience, but so much of this work is sketch-based and being elsewhere and coming back. So do you feel like in this sort of medium that you're working in with sketching,
you're more intimate in these thoughts and feelings, or is this more of a travel-based, I'm elsewhere and now I'm bringing all of this home with me and creating a lens that way?
Let me just repeat your question to make sure I understand it. Is it more of like a lens, like I'm traveling elsewhere, I'm getting stuff and bringing it back and working that way, as opposed to, what was the first part? You can just tell me, it's fine.
Do you think that your usual medium
Yeah.
of creating installations and
materials.
experiences is more of a barrier with you than creating these sketches and using that as a medium that's more intimate, maybe?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to practicality. Like, I like the idea that I could make work while I was traveling, while I was doing something. And this was like a way to do that. It wasn't like I intended to do that. I was just like, I could do that. Like, I had a backpack. I literally carried this group of 80 works around with me for 5 years, you know, like just wherever I was going, I could have them there. I could take out, I could draw something, I could put something in there. And so it became, yeah, it was sort of like, oh, I can keep making work and keep doing things while I'm doing the other stuff. But I think also a lot of the images and the other big stuff that comes out of that work, it kind of starts with some of the drawings. But then also a lot of the drawings that I do within there kind of reflect back to the work itself. So it's like it's a dialogue, I think, like a conversation that I'm having with myself, I guess, with the bigger objects and the bigger things. And, you know, I think the big work, too, it's very tactile and experiential, but I also think the drawings are, too. Like, they both have a very similar relationship to itself. It's just harder to look at the big stuff and get that sense in images, I think, you know, than it is sort of being in it and being there. But I think, yeah, there's something, there's an openness that I have with the drawings, with these images that that's more clearly in lines with my thinking, with how I kind of relate an image to a text or understand how those two things relate or how they don't relate at the same time, you know? Like it's almost like a one-to-one relationship you can have. And it also, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here that has nothing to do with your question. I think about, there's this slide talk, there's this slide piece that Video Conchi made, who's a video artist, performance artist, where he gives a standard artist talk. It's called Artist Talk as a piece, where you're like, I did this work then, this is what's happening then, and he's sort of giving this dialogue about, you know, just like a standard art, like what you just saw, kind of. Like, here's my work, this is what it's about, this is what's happening. And then he would switch to like a blank slide, and then just like talk in this creepy voice about like, and this is when you broke up with me, and it's happening, and he was just talking about his ex-wife, like just laying out his personal life within there. And then he would switch to the next slide and talk about the work, and then switch to another one, blank one after that. And it was like this idea that like, you're never gonna know what's going on with an artist, with his work and what's happening within there. But the idea that you can put yourself out there in that way, that these two, it creates this kind of interesting tension that's kind of going on. And so when I look back at this work that I'm doing, I feel like that's kind of creating that tension a little bit, or something similar to that, if I was to describe what's going on. Because, you know, you get pieces, but it's kind of like the fun is sort of understanding it, kind of bringing it together. I also oftentimes like think about my work a little bit like Frankenstein too, where it's like Frankenstein's monster, actually, not Frankenstein because that's the scientist, but like you know, you're making a monster, and you have all these dead pieces of people, of things that have their own history, have their own story, but you put them together to create something new, you know? And it's great to go back and sort of be like, oh, this person had this arm or this leg or this thing, but you're kind of creating its own fiction, its own new thing within there. And that's what's really exciting to me about the work, is I get to create something new out of my life. And yeah, there you go.
Thank you so much. And I think maybe if there's a quick question, we might have time for one more question. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed listening to all of you. So I read an interview with Alice, and one of the artists that you mentioned that's had a great influence on your work was Magritte. And so I was really curious what other artists all of you have been influenced by. I'll
go first. I think what you can actually, specifically in this piece, what you can kind of, I feel like what you'll see more than anything, there's this artist, Joe Bernard, who I'm always been kind of a fan of. And he did this, there was a book he did with this poet, John Ashbery, called the Vermont Notebooks. And it kind of isn't well known as, like Ashbery's like kind of seminal work kind of came out maybe the summer before, which was like Self-Portrait as a Convex Mirror, where it's like, it's poetry, where he's sort of understanding language and taking it apart and putting it together. And my background, actually, in my undergrad, I mostly took painting and poetry classes, and then I went to grad school for sculpture. And so I think my work, it's very painterly. It very much relates to painterly, but it's also very poetic too, in my understanding. But I also make physical things that exist in space that you kind of relate to. So all those things kind of connect a little bit in my work. But I like that book because there was sort of a conversation the two of them are having between one person being a poet and the other person kind of making these drawings. So I think they're just simple ink drawings that we're kind of going to. And so that's been something I've always been kind of, it's just kind of in me a little bit. And sometimes you just get art and it gets in you so much you kind of forget about it. And so, but there's a lot of art, obviously, that I look at and I kind of get obsessed with, but thought I'd start there. Who wants to go next?
It's a hard question. I would say in graduate school, one of the references that I think mattered most to me, and it has the most influence and direct association that you could see within the work now, is not necessarily one individual, but many of the Chicano muralists in California. Because this kind of association with labor in particular, United Farm Workers, as well as then Mexican and Aztec and pre-Columbian iconography, is something that has been done before, and it's done by other artists, and it's not necessarily like I'm in any shape or form the inventor of this. And so it really has so much to do with like, how is then maybe this a continuation of that kind of mentality of how do we remember and discover more about ourselves, about our histories, our culture, is when give new life to that in the present day more than anything.
I guess I can add to Magritte a little bit, and just some artists that I haven't looked at in a while, but that were sort of early influences for me, just thinking about language, are artists who work with text. So Kay Rosen was someone whose work I looked at a lot.
She's great.
Yeah, she's awesome. And Ed Ruscha and the many artists who've worked with text. And at that time, I was working with text more in my work, and I found myself leaving it behind eventually, so I had to process through it. But the way that those artists work with language was deeply influential to me. Yeah.
Can I add something? Do you mind? I apologize. I was also very early on in my work, and even now, I'm still really influenced by early West Coast assemblage artists, like artists who are sort of out in the world finding materials and making things for themselves, but also finding these social connections, like social contracts that were happening within there. And so there were a lot of people out there working at the time, both David Hammonds, Marion Hassinger, Singen Ngudi, who were also dancers before they kind of transitioned into art. But also, there was Bruce Conner in the RBA. There's all these other artists sort of finding things and kind of working at that time with different contexts and different things. And so that was also a very big influence on me and my work. I think we could all just talk about artists we love for like a very long time.
I was going to say, we could talk for hours.
Yeah.
But I just want to thank all of you so much for coming and being on this panel, and thank you to the artists that are in the regional that are out here in the audience. And then also thank you to everyone who came to see this show. We're really excited to present it here at Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art. So thank you so much. And we'll, be here, so feel free to chat with us more after the doors open. Thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.